How would you move Mount Fuji? Why is a manhole cover round? Imagine you have a room with 3 light bulbs and you have 3 light switches outside of the room. You could only go into the room once. How do you know which light switch corresponds to which light bulb? Man, these are tough questions. If I were in an interview and I got one of those questions, I'd just be like, what do I respond with? Now, when I first interviewed at Microsoft many years ago, I remember I went online and I searched for interview questions, and those were the types of questions that popped up. Those are what's known as brain teasers. And man, they really do hurt your brain because you got to think pretty deeply about how to respond to a question like that. It turns out those types of questions are not good indicators of how good of a candidate you are, which is pretty crazy. And interviewing at Microsoft has completely transformed since then. Today, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk through what a typical interview at Microsoft is like. Why would I know that? Well, kind of crazy to say this, but I've been at Microsoft now for 13 years. Not only have I interviewed on many different teams throughout the company, in fact, I've been in many different roles in the company, but I've also conducted many different interviews. The typical interview day starts out, you'll come in the morning, you usually start at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., and you'll start with someone in HR. And so you have a quick little interview just to kind of break the ice, get you kind of relaxed, get you into the rhythm of interviewing. The typical interview day has about 5 to 6 different interviews. So yes, that's a long day. Talking to 5 or 6 different people, it gets pretty tiring. The reason you talk to 5 or 6 different people is we want to get different points of you as a candidate. And typically what will happen is each interviewer is looking at a different skill set. So you might have one person looking at how data-driven is this person. You might have someone else looking at what is their teamwork ability? What is their problem-solving ability? How do they collaborate? So each candidate or each interviewer will ask the candidate different questions trying to get at these different competencies. And then you typically have one person at the end of the day, they're the final decision maker. So what they'll do is they'll read the feedback from each of the interviewers, and then they are the ones to make the final call on is this the right candidate to bring to the company. Now, each interviewer, they don't talk to each other much between the interviews. They might say things like, hey, I didn't get a chance to dig into this. Why don't you dig into that some more? But typically, you don't want to talk to the other interviewers because you don't want to bias the interview. I mean, imagine I came to you and said, hey, this candidate, they were awful. Oh gosh, like it was just bad. The next interviewer, they'd probably take that and say, oh man, they're not that good. And then you go in with that bias up front, or it could go the other way too. So when you come into the interview, what'll happen is, let's say I'm an interviewer, I might ask a question like, so, first you break the ice, you have some chit chat, and then you might say something like, hey, why don't you tell me about a group project that you worked on, whether it's in school or whether it's at a company, or maybe tell me about your favorite group project that you worked on. This is a behavioral interview question. Now, behavioral interview question, what that means is we're looking at your past behavior because we believe that that's an indicator of what your future behavior will be. And keep in mind, this is not what you should do with the stock market. Don't look at companies and then say, hey, they've done well in the past. I should invest in that because I believe it'll do well in the future. So what we do is with behavioral interview questions, with this group question example. So tell me about a group project you worked on. And I'll start out by saying, hey, tell me about the situation. What was the situation? And so let's say you're a college student who's interviewing. You'll say, well, it was in my engineering class, or it was in, I don't know, a business class that I was taking. And we had 4 different teammates and we were just automatically assigned them, and we had to look at blah, blah, blah. So we had to look at the situation. As an interviewer, one of the hardest things is I have no idea what you worked on. I don't know what projects you were on. I don't know who you were working with. Give me as much context as possible. I've had so many interviewees come in where they tell me a story and I just get lost because I don't have any of the background. I wasn't in the class with you. So you need to just ground everything and tell me about the situation. The second thing that you should cover as an interviewee, and as an interviewer, something I want to hear is, what were you specifically responsible for? So if you're working with other people or you're working as part of a project, what part of the project did you drive? What part did you own? Maybe you say, well, I was in this group project and we divided it up in this way, and this is the part that I was responsible for. The next thing I like to hear about is, what were the actions you took? So if it was an extremely hard problem that you were trying to solve, I talked to X, Y, and Z, and I kept working on a solution, and I did research, I talked to the professor, I worked with other teams, or I talked to customers and I wanted to understand from customers what they wanted. I want to hear what you did to go about solving this problem. And kind of once you've walked through that, the third thing is, what was the result of all the work you did? So what was the outcome of all the actions you took? And typically we want to see that you were thoughtful about what the result was, that you had a sense up front of what the result would be. So that's kind of the typical thing I want to hear. And then kind of the last thing that I want to hear as part of a response for an interview question is self-reflection. If you could go back in time, would you have done anything differently? And now it is unbelievable how many people come in and I'm like, hey, so would you have done anything differently? And everything I do in life, I don't do things perfectly, and I could think back at anything and say, yeah, I would have done this a little differently, or in hindsight, I would have done that a little differently. A lot of people come in and they say, yeah, actually, it was perfect. I wouldn't do anything differently. And that's a big red flag, because do you want to work with a teammate who doesn't think back and think, hey, how could I have done something differently? So that's a typical flow. I refer to it as the STARS process, where tell me about the situation, tell me about the task you did, tell me what actions you took, tell me about the results that you achieved. And then lastly, self-reflect, and can you think about how you would have done something differently? So that's the typical format I like seeing in interview response. And if someone interviewing isn't following that format, I'll nudge them along and help them along that flow. If you're responding to one of these types of interview questions, it's really hard to fake the question, because you'll have a question like, hey, tell me about your favorite group project you worked on. And then the question is going to go very deep, and I'll ask probing questions. I'll say, hey, tell me more about that, or tell me more about this, or tell me what happened there, tell me why that happened. As an interviewer, I mostly like to listen. So I want to do much less of the talking and let the other person do most of the talking. And so I try to find things like, hey, are they a good collaborator? Or would they be a good teammate? At the end of the day, with any interview, as an interviewer, what you're trying to do is you're looking at the person saying, hey, is this someone who I'd want to work with? The way I like to think about it is, imagine that I had my own startup and I was hiring my number two, the second employee for my company. Is this someone who I'd want to hire? Is this someone who would elevate my company, or is it someone who would slow down the company? So that's how I usually think about interviews. In the description, I have a whole bunch of sample questions. You can take a look at those. They're just different questions I get at different competencies. You could take a look at that. The way I usually prepare for an interview when I'm interviewing is I'll actually look at those interview questions and I'll think of stories from either, if when I was younger, I would look at school and say, hey, what are projects that demonstrate or would provide a good response to those questions? Or now that I'm in the workforce, I think about what projects that I work on that would really demonstrate what they're looking for in those questions well. And so these are good questions to kind of look through and then formulate stories that really help answer those questions. And if you do that, it's really a good process. And one thing that's really amazed me is I'll go into interviews and I've done that prep work, and most of the questions that you get in an interview line up exactly with those types of questions. You know, I've interviewed at Microsoft, I've interviewed at Accenture, at Amazon, all these other companies, and you find that the interview questions tend to be pretty similar or pretty consistent. Now, the one thing I haven't interviewed for is a developer question at Microsoft. You could expect a developer question to be pretty similar to this, because you still want to find out, is this person a good teammate? But the one difference will be is you'll also have some coding questions in addition to that. So I hope you found this video helpful. This is just a quick preview of what it's like to interview at Microsoft. I think it's pretty similar to the types of interview questions that you get at many other companies. Many other companies have also adopted behavioral interview questions. But this is how we interview at Microsoft. I think it's similar to how other companies interview. If you found this helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content like this, please hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll get a notification anytime new content like this comes out. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.